The sky had been orange for 11 months. Not the warm orange of a sunset, not the amber of a city in winter. Something harsher than that, something that had no business existing in a sky that used to be blue. It was the color of a wound. It was the color of the Vethka atmosphere processors working at full burn, converting everything the human colonists had planted and seeded and breathed into something the Vethka could use. Corporal Tara Nkosi had stopped looking up by month 2. You only looked up when you needed to remember what you'd lost, and she'd decided early on that grief was a luxury she couldn't afford. She was lying on her back under the engine housing of a dead crawler when the shooting started. Not close. 2 kilometers, maybe 3. The flat cracking echo of human rifles, which meant someone was still alive out there, which meant someone was about to not be. She let the wrench sit still in her hands and listened. The firefight lasted 40 seconds. She counted them out. Then silence, and the silence said everything a silence can say. She pulled herself out from under the crawler and looked at the other 3 people in the relay station. Vasquez was already at the window, rifle half raised, watching the scrubland to the east. He had a bad leg from the Callaway Bridge incident 3 months back, and he stood at a slight lean, weight on the right, the way a person learns to stand when they've accepted that pain is just furniture now. Behind him, Sung closing up the medkit she'd been reorganizing, closing it with the deliberate, unhurried care of someone who'd already decided that panic was a choice she didn't make. And in the corner, on the floor with his back against the cracked concrete wall, was the boy they'd found 6 days ago wandering the red flats with no unit insignia and no boots. He'd told them his name was Davi. He was 19, maybe. He had the eyes of someone much older. "How many of ours left out there?" Davi asked. His voice was flat and factual, the way voices get when they've spent a long time not asking the questions they actually want answered. "Station 7 went dark 4 days ago," Nkosi said. "Before that, Stations 3 and 12. She set the wrench down on the crawler's hood, where it made a sound like a period at the end of a sentence. "We're it." Nobody replied to that. There was nothing to say to it that wouldn't sound like either false comfort or unnecessary cruelty, and they were all past both. The relay station had been a fuel depot once, in the first year of the colony, back when there was still an idea that the colony was a permanent thing, that the streets of New Maribor would one day have restaurants and parks and arguments about parking. The Vethka had arrived in the 14th month and spent about 6 weeks being confused by the humans' inability to accept that the planet belonged to them now. The Vethka were a patient species in most regards, but they had difficulty understanding refusal on a conceptual level. It was not in their architecture. They processed new information through consensus update cycles, which meant that by the time the Vethka High Command had finished recalibrating their behavioral models to account for the fact that humans simply would not stop fighting even when fighting was clearly pointless, about 60% of the colony was gone. The remaining 40% had scattered into the scrubland and the old industrial zones and the dead towns between them. That was 5 months ago. Now there were 4 people in a fuel depot that smelled like rust and old grease, with 2 working rifles between them, 12 days of ration packs, and a communications relay that might or might not be broadcasting to anyone who might or might not still be listening. Vasquez came away from the window. "Movement," he said. 200 meters. Not Vethka. Nkosi picked up her rifle without hurrying. Alive? Stumbling. So, yes, probably. She went to the door and cracked it open. The orange sky pressed down on the flats like something heavy. In the middle distance, a figure was making its way across the broken ground with the gait of someone operating entirely on the wrong side of exhaustion. The kind of walking that isn't really walking anymore, that's just falling forward in a controlled way and hoping the feet keep up. She watched for 15 seconds, looking past the figure for the telltale, reflective shimmer of a Vethka patrol carapace. "Nothing. Cover me," she said. Vasquez said, "Always do." She went out. The figure turned out to be a woman of about 40, in the torn remnants of a colony engineer's vest, with a long cut down her left forearm that had been wrapped in a piece of shirt that had long since soaked through. She had dark hair plastered to her face, and she was carrying a small pack that she clearly hadn't put down in a very long time. When she saw Nkosi coming, she stopped walking and stood very still, which was the right instinct. The wrong instinct in that situation was to run. And running told you a lot about a person. "How many behind you?" Nkosi called. "Nobody," the woman said. "I'm it." Nkosi looked at the planes behind her for another 5 seconds. Then she said, "Come on." Her name was Reyes. She'd been a geological surveyor before. She'd been alone for 3 weeks. She sat on an overturned fuel drum and let Sung dress the arm without making any noise about it, and she drank half a liter of water in one go and didn't apologize for it. When she was done, she looked at the 4 of them arranged around the depot and said, "So what's the plan? Not a question." "An inventory. Stay alive," Nkosi said. "There's a secondary objective, I hope. We're broadcasting on the resistance frequency. We keep the relay running. Someone's listening." Reyes looked at the relay unit on the shelf near the back wall, a cobbled-together box of reclaimed components and salvaged Vethka signal hardware that had taken Nkosi 3 weeks to build and still made sounds that worried her. "That thing works," intermittently. Reyes was quiet for a moment. Then, conversationally, "My entire survey team walked into a Vethka sweep 2 weeks ago because they were following coordinates that came off a signal that turned out to be Vethka disinformation. 8 people." She paused. "Intermittently might be a problem." Nobody argued with her. The days passed the way days pass when survival is the full schedule. There were watches to stand and water reclamation filters to check and rifle components to clean and perimeter wire to maintain and, underneath all of it, the constant low-frequency arithmetic of diminishing resources. 12 days of rations became 10, became 7, became 5. The crawler's engine was beyond saving, and Nkosi had established that definitively on the 3rd day, which meant that the only way out of the relay station on short notice was on foot, across open scrubland, under an orange sky that made every human being look like a target on a shooting range. They talked because silence was worse. Vasquez had grown up in a city on Earth's southern coast that he described in pieces, across different evenings, as though he was rationing the memory, the outdoor markets, the salt smell, a particular bar where his father had once punched a man in a disagreement about football that everyone in the family still thought was hilarious. He told the story about the bar 3 times total. Nobody pointed that out. Sung had been a trauma surgeon in the colony's medical facility. She talked about patients the way some people talk about old friends, not with sentimentality, but with the precision of someone who'd earned the details. She'd made her peace with a lot of things, she said, and the way she said, it suggested the peacemaking had been difficult work. David didn't talk about himself much. He talked about everything else, the Vethka, their behavior patterns, the way their patrol routes changed based on what they were prioritizing, the way their carapace-mounted sensors had a 15-degree blind spot in their dorsal scan that you could exploit if you were patient. He knew things he shouldn't know for a 19-year-old, with no unit insignia and no boots. When Nkosi finally asked him directly where he'd gotten his information, he was quiet for a while, and then he said, "I was with a special operations unit. I was the only one who came out of our last engagement." "What unit?" he told her. She knew the designation. She knew what it meant. She didn't ask anything else. Reyes, when she talked about what the planet had been before the Vethka. She'd done her surveying in the years before colonization, and she'd walked terrain that no human being had seen before her. And she described it with a geologist's love of specificity, the particular red-orange of the iron-rich soil in the northern flats, the way a certain ridge formation caught the wind and produced a sound like something breathing, a cave system in the eastern mountains that had formations she didn't have words for, that she'd photographed from 20 angles and still felt she hadn't captured. She'd named the cave system after her daughter, who was on Earth and was 11 years old. Nkosi listened to all of it and said little. She kept the relay running. She stood her watches. She did the arithmetic of the dwindling rations and tried not to let the conclusion of the arithmetic show on her face. On the 8th day, the relay picked up something. It came through at 0300. While Nkosi was on watch, a carrier signal on a frequency she'd encoded herself 3 months ago, which meant it was coming from somewhere that had her specific code key, which meant it was coming from Resistance Command. She bent over the unit and worked the signal for an hour, pulling it cleaner, and by 0400, she had a message. It was short. It said there was a transport window in 72 hours. Coordinates 40 kilometers northeast. The transport would hold for a 6-hour window before the orbital situation forced departure. After that, there was no projected second opportunity. She sat with the message for a while. 40 kilometers in 72 hours was not a reasonable ask for a group with a bad leg, a healing arm wound, limited water, no vehicle, and a route that would require crossing 2 known Vethka patrol corridors. It was the kind of ask you made when you had no other ask to make. She woke the others at 0500. They looked at the message. They looked at the map. Vasquez did the math out loud about his leg, and about the terrain, and about how far they could push in how many hours, and when he finished, nobody said anything for a moment, and then Reyes said, "What's the alternative?" Again, not a question. "We stay here," Nkosi said. "The rations run out. We move eventually anyway, with no destination. Or we move now with one." Sung was looking at the map. "The second patrol corridor, here." She put her finger on it. "There's a drainage cut that runs parallel to the main Vethka route. 20 meters lower, rock walls on both sides. Sensor scatter from the iron content in the rock formation would degrade their scan range significantly." "How do you know that?" Davi asked. "I read the geological survey files when we still had system access." She glanced at Reyes. "Your work, actually." Reyes looked at the map. Something moved across her face that wasn't quite a smile. "The Haslan cut. Yes, I surveyed that." She paused. "I named it after nobody. I could never think of anyone good enough for it." "You could name it after yourself," Davi said. "I did. I just didn't say so." They left at first light, which in the orange sky meant a shift from dark orange to medium orange, and a temperature drop of about 3 degrees as the atmosphere processors shifted to their daytime cycle. Nkosi went first, then Reyes and Sung together, then Davi, then Vasquez last. Not because they thought of him as the rear guard, though he was, but because it let him set his own pace without anyone watching him work through the pain. The scrubland offered cover in the form of the dead acacia analogs that had been one of the colony's more ambitious terraforming projects, fast-growing native adapted trees that had achieved about 2 meters of height before the atmosphere conversion began killing them. They stood in rows and clusters across the flats, gray-brown and leafless, and from a distance they looked like a crowd of people standing very still, which was an observation Nkosi had made once early on and hadn't been able to completely unthink since. They made 11 kilometers on the first day without encountering anything. They found a dry stream with a seep of filtered groundwater that let them top off their containers. Vasquez's leg held. Nobody talked much, because sound carried in flat terrain and also because the weight of what they were doing. Walking 40 kilometers under a dead sky toward a window of 6 hours that would not open twice didn't leave a lot of room for conversation. That night they sheltered in a collapsed prefab building, one of the outpost structures from the colony's first surveying push, and Nkosi took first watch while the others slept, and she sat in the opening that had once been a doorway and looked at the orange sky and the stars behind it. The Vethka's atmosphere processors hadn't changed the stars. She thought about that sometimes. The alien indifference of stars, the way they watched everything without caring. The way the same stars she'd watched as a child in Johannesburg were watching this ruined colony now. It didn't comfort her, exactly, but it was something to hold. Davi came and sat beside her, around 200. He wasn't due for watch until 400, and she told him so. "I know," he said. "I don't sleep well." She didn't push it. He had the look of someone who'd made peace with not sleeping in the same way Sung had made peace with other things, through the particular exhaustion that becomes its own kind of rest. They sat for a while without talking. The night made sounds, whined through the dead trees, the distant low throb of a Vethka processor tower. A small animal that had survived somewhere in the ground and was moving through the rubble somewhere to their left with tiny, insistent life. "My whole unit," Davi said eventually, not explaining which unit or which moment, but she knew. "They were the best people I've ever known. And I've been thinking ever since, what makes a person worth knowing? What it costs to." He stopped, started over. "I used to think love was a thing you earned, that you had to deserve it. And then I watched people I loved die, and I realized that's completely wrong. Love is the thing that just happens whether or not the math works out." Nkosi considered that. "You're 19. "Yeah, you shouldn't know that yet." "I know," he was quiet. "I don't recommend the method." She almost laughed. It surprised her enough that she had to put a hand over her mouth, which made it worse. And then they were both sitting there in the doorway of a collapsed building at the edge of a ruined colony on a planet that wasn't anyone's anymore, and trying not to laugh, which was a specifically human kind of absurd. "Get some sleep," she said, when she could say things again. "Even an hour." "You too," he said. "Later." "I'll take 0300. He did. The second day was harder. They hit the first patrol corridor mid-morning and spent 2 hours in a rubble depression watching a Vethka sensor array sweep the flats before the pattern gave them a gap. The Vethka moved in the way things moved when they had never needed to learn stealth, with deliberate, unhurried certainty. each footfall placed with precision, their carapaces catching the orange light and throwing it back in hard facets. They were objectively beautiful in a way that Nkosi had noticed and resented noticing. She had nothing against beautiful things. She had everything against beautiful things that were trying to kill her. Vasquez identified the gap in the sweep pattern. It was a 40-second window every 8 minutes. They went through 2 pairs at a time with Davi running point and came through clean. The second corridor was the one they'd planned for. The Haslin cut was exactly what Reyes had said it would be. A deep drainage channel with walls of red iron-rich rock that rose 6 meters on both sides, turning the world into a narrow strip of orange sky above and the sound of their footsteps below. The Vethka's sensor scatter was real. Nkosi watched her jury-rigged sensor unit the whole way through, and the patrol signatures stayed distant, confused, unable to resolve. Reyes walked through it with a particular kind of quiet that Nkosi recognized, the quiet of someone in a place they've been before. When the place has changed, but the bone memory of it is still in the feet. "You spent a lot of time in here," Nkosi said softly. "Weeks," Reyes said. "I mapped every meter of it. I slept in here twice when the weather turned bad." She ran a hand along the rock wall without slowing. "I found a formation about 200 meters back that I've never seen described in any geological literature. I wrote it up. I don't know if the paper ever got filed." "It did," Sung said quietly from behind them. "I read it. I read a lot of things when I was on night shifts. I thought it was extraordinary." Reyes didn't say anything for a moment. Then she said, "Thank you," in the particular way people say thank you when they mean something much larger than the 2 words. They emerged from the cut in the late afternoon and made another 8 kilometers before dark. 23 kilometers, 17 to go, 20 hours left in the window. That night, Sung dressed Reyes's arm again and said it was healing cleanly, and Reyes said she'd had worse, which was probably true. Vasquez took off his boot and looked at his leg with the dispassionate expression of a man assessing a vehicle's performance and deciding whether to push it further, and put the boot back on without saying anything. Davi ate half his ration bar and gave the other half to Vasquez without making a thing of it, and Vasquez took it without making a thing of it, which was the right call from both of them. Nkosi checked the relay unit's portable component. The resistance signal was still there, still holding the same coordinates, still real. She thought about what Davi had said, about love happening whether or not the math worked out. She thought about the people she'd lost in 11 months, her lieutenant, who'd been a difficult man and a brilliant tactician, and who died in a drainage ditch 3 kilometers from the original colony center, her squad, a woman she'd known only for 6 weeks and had somehow become the person she'd told things to, the planet in a way, the blue sky. The thing about grief she'd found was that it didn't get smaller, it got more familiar. You learned the shape of it in the dark, and you stopped being surprised when your hands found it. And after a while, you could carry it and still carry other things, which wasn't the same as it not being there. She looked at these 4 people in the ruins of a prefab shelter. Vasquez with his eyes closed, not asleep, but resting with the discipline of someone who'd learned to extract recovery from whatever was available. Sung cleaning her hands with the methodical care that never left her. Reyes with her eyes on the middle distance, somewhere in her geological survey notes, in the cave named after herself. Davi watching the doorway with the patient alertness of someone who'd learned very young that doors mattered. She had known none of them 6 weeks ago. The math on all of them surviving to the transport window was not good math. She'd been doing it since the message came in, and she kept arriving at the same place. She stopped doing the math. She started planning the route instead. The last day began before dawn. They made 6 kilometers in the dark, navigating by the portable unit's terrain mapping and Reyes's memory of the flats, which turned out to be extraordinarily precise. When the orange sky started to lighten, they were 12 kilometers out. The Vethka found them at 11. It wasn't a patrol sweep. It was something worse. A tracking unit, 2 of them, moving with the low, fast gait that meant they'd been following a signature and were close enough to resolve it. Kosi saw the carapace glint first, half a kilometer southeast, and said move in a tone that everybody understood. They ran. Not full sprint. Vasquez couldn't full sprint, and full sprint across open scrubland against Vethka tracking velocity was a losing bet regardless. They moved at the fastest pace that kept them together, through the gray-brown dead trees, and Nkosi could hear the tracking units closing, and she was running the numbers, and the numbers were bad. There was a structure 300 meters ahead. She'd seen it on the terrain map. Old Colony Water Processing Station. Reinforced concrete. Pre-invasion. She pointed and didn't say anything, and everyone understood. They made it through the door with 40 seconds to spare. The interior was dark and smelled of standing water and old mineral deposits. One room, 2 entry points, 1 blown-out window. Vasquez went to the window. Sung moved Reyes to the far wall and crouched behind a row of holding tanks. Davi took up position beside the door. Nkosi stood in the center of the room and thought. The tracking units would be outside in 30 seconds. Their sensor arrays would map the interior before they entered. They had 6 rounds of hardpoint ammunition between the 2 rifles that would penetrate Vethka carapace at close range and 2 that might. The tracking units' carapaces were reinforced compared to patrol units. She knew this because Davi had told her, and she trusted Davi's operational knowledge completely. She thought about the math. Davi, she said. Yeah, their dorsal scan blind spot. 15 degrees high, 0 to 22 centimeters left of the midline. Yes. How do you get under their dorsal scan when they're moving? You don't. You get below their movement plane entirely, below the torso line. Flat, like floor flat. She looked at the floor, then she looked at Vasquez, then she said, "Give me your rifle." Vasquez looked at her. She could see him doing the math, not the survival math, but the specific math of what she was proposing and arriving at the same place she had. He handed her the rifle. "Don't," Vasquez said. He said it quietly. Not as a command, but as the kind of word people say when they know the word won't change anything, and they say it anyway because some things need to be said. "There are 2 of them," Nkosi said. "Outside. If they come in here together, the angles are wrong and we lose. If I can separate them at the entry point, 1 at a time, with both rifles and the blind spot, it works." "It works if neither of us misses," Vasquez said. "Neither of us will miss." He looked at her for a moment. "No," he said, "neither of us will." She went to the door. She cracked it open. She could see the first tracking unit 15 meters out, moving in the deliberate way. Carapace facets catching the flat orange light, head array sweeping in its pattern. The second one was 8 meters behind the first and 3 meters left. She pulled the door to. To Davi, she said quietly, "Timer. Counting," he said. She let the sweep pattern complete 1 full cycle, watching the light change through the crack in the door. She thought about the blue sky, not as grief, as a simple fact, that it had existed, that she had seen it, that it was, in some technical sense, still there above the orange, unchanged, waiting with the patience of a sky that has been there longer than anything that has ever looked at it. The door opened. What happened next was very fast and not complicated. She went flat before the first tracking unit's sensor array resolved the room, and from flat she had the dorsal blind spot, and she put both shots in it, and the first unit went down. Vasquez, from the window, had the angle on the second unit while it was still processing the first unit's collapse, and he put 3 rounds in the carapace junction at the neck, and the second unit went down. 4 seconds. Silence. Nobody moved for 10 seconds. Then Davi let out a breath, slow and controlled, and said, 9 kilometers, meaning the transport window, meaning the math had changed. 9 kilometers, Nkosi confirmed. She stood up. Her hands were steady, which surprised her, and then didn't. She'd been steady when she needed to be steady for 11 months. The body learned things. Vasquez was looking at the 2 down tracking units. "They'll have reported our position," he said. "More will come. Then we run." They ran. Not recklessly, with the focused, ground-eating lope of people who have decided to spend everything they have left on a single direction. Vasquez ran on his bad leg and didn't fall. Reyes ran with her injured arm held close and didn't fall. Sung ran and navigated from the terrain unit simultaneously, calling adjustments without breaking stride. Davi ran point, threading the dead trees, reading the ground with the trained attention of someone who'd learned that the ground held information. Nkosi ran and breathed and did not look up. At 6 kilometers, Davi found a dry creek gully that ran northeast, and they dropped into it and followed it, which took 2 kilometers off the exposed approach and cut their time by 20 minutes. The gully smelled of mineral earth and something faintly biological that Reyes, without breaking stride, identified as a nitrogen-fixing microorganism that was endemic to this drainage type and was, as far as she knew, one of about 4 remaining living soil processes on the entire surveyed portion of the continent. "It'll come back," Reyes said between breaths. "It goes dormant, it comes back." Nobody had asked. She'd said it anyway. Nkosi filed it somewhere in the back of her mind, in the place where she put things that needed to survive the next few hours. The transport was a retrofitted colony hauler, the kind that had moved surveying equipment in the colony's first year, now armored in reclaimed Vethka ablative panels that made it look like something that had started a fight with an alien ship and won ugly. It was sitting in the flat, dead space of a former crop field, running dark, and they would not have seen it at all if they hadn't known the exact coordinates. A figure at the hauler's hatch waved them in. They went. Inside smelled like people who'd been scared for a long time and were trying not to show it. There were 14 others, sitting in rows along the cargo walls, and they had the particular look that Nkosi recognized from her own reflection, the look of people who'd been carrying too much for too long and were just now, incrementally, beginning to set it down. The hatch sealed. The hauler's engines burned to life, the sound of them lost in the general noise of a Vethka atmospheric cycle shift that ran every 6 hours and produced enough electromagnetic scatter to mask a significant launch signature, which was why the window existed, which was why it was 6 hours, which was why the math had always been possible and just not comfortable. They lifted. The acceleration pressed everyone back against the cargo walls. Nkosi felt it as something physical that was also something else. The release of a tension she'd been holding at a specific muscle level for 11 months, a tension she hadn't been fully aware of as tension because it had become the baseline. Her whole body had been braced against a planet that was trying to kill her, and now the planet was falling away, and the brace released, and for a moment she couldn't tell if she was breathing or not. She was breathing. Vasquez was beside her, his bad legs stretched out, and he closed his eyes. And for the first time in weeks, his face was doing something that wasn't vigilance. Sung sat very still with her hands in her lap and watched the ceiling of the hauler as though she could see through it. Reyes had her eyes open and was looking at nothing, and Nkosi understood. She was doing the inventory. Everything she'd mapped, everything she'd named, the cave, the cut, the microorganism that went dormant and came back. All of it still down there under the orange sky, under the Vethka processors. Alive in the way things stay alive when nothing is trying to make them alive. Just persisting, stubbornly, on the molecular level, waiting. Davi was beside her on the other side from Vasquez. He was looking at his hands. "Hey," she said. He looked up. "You going to be okay?" He thought about it for a real moment, not the reflexive way. "I don't know yet," he said. "I think so." A pause. "You?" She thought about the blue sky. Not as grief, not as loss, but as a fact. Something that had been and would be again, that the orange was sitting on top of like weather, not like permanence. The Vethka were doing what the Vethka did, and had no framework for what humans did, which was refuse the conclusion of the math, which was carry the people beside them through corridors in the rock and across flats under a wrong-colored sky and into a 6-hour window that the universe had left open just slightly longer than it needed to, because the universe occasionally had the decency to do that. "Yeah," she said. "I think so." The orange sky gave way to the upper atmosphere, which was blue-black, which was almost blue, which was the right direction. Below them, the Haslin Cut ran its 11-kilometer course through the iron-red stone. Empty now, the sensor scattered doing its work. A small anonymous animal moving through the rubble somewhere in the dark. The microorganism in the drainage soil cycled through its chemistry. The cave Reyes had named after herself sat in the eastern mountains with formations that had no names yet, waiting for someone to come back and make them known. The stars appeared, indifferent and ancient, the same stars that had watched everything. Nkosi looked at them and felt the weight of the last 11 months not disappear but shift, become something she was carrying differently. The way you learn to carry weight when you've walked a long way with it. There was a world below. There would be a fight ahead. The math was still the math, and the math would always require the answer that the math did not contain, which was this. 4 people in a fuel depot. A liter of water passed without ceremony. A half-ration bar moved from one hand to another. A story told 3 times about a bar and a punch thrown over football. A laugh suppressed in a collapsed doorway in the dark. A geological survey of a cave named after a woman who named it after herself. The things that could not be measured, adding up to the only total that mattered. They rose into the dark, and the dark was full of stars, and somewhere beyond it there was a blue sky that had not been burned away, only hidden, waiting with the patience of things that have existed longer than anything that has ever needed them. It had been there the whole time. It would be there when they came back.